The wind howled across the prairie that night, carrying with it the bitter bite of approaching rain. Samuel Turner had lived on the frontier long enough to know when a storm was rolling in, and this one promised to be a mean one. He had just finished bolting the shutters on the small windows of his cabin when he heard Ida's sharp, urgent knocking against the door. For a moment, he froze, his hand tightening around the rifle he carried almost like a second limb. Out here, a knock in the middle of the night was rarely a good thing. It could be a drifter looking for food, or worse, a raiding party using a trick to lure him out. The sound came again, louder this time, frantic, desperate. Samuel pressed his ear to the door but heard nothing except the storm beginning to break overhead. He debated ignoring it, but something inside wouldn't let him. With a slow breath, he lifted the latch, rifle at the ready, and pulled the heavy door open just a crack. Standing there in the driving rain was a young girl, her dark hair plastered to her face, her eyes wide and glistening with fear. She wore deerskin clothing, soaked through, and clutched at a small satchel pressed against her chest. She couldn't have been more than 16, perhaps younger. Samuel's first thought was that she was Comanche, and his chest tightened. He knew what that meant. The girl lifted her chin, lips trembling as she tried to speak. "Please," she whispered in halting English, the word breaking with cold. "Help." That was all, just one word, but enough to still Samuel's hand from pushing the door shut. Against every instinct screaming inside him to turn her away, he opened the door wider. The girl stumbled forward, her small body shivering violently as the warmth of the cabin wrapped around her. Samuel shut the door against the storm, his heart pounding harder than the thunder outside. He laid his rifle on the table but kept it within reach, his eyes never leaving her. She looked around the cabin cautiously, as though expecting a trap, before sinking down near the fire. Samuel moved to the hearth, added more wood, and watched as the flames sprang higher, casting light on her face. She was young, but her expression was not. There was weight behind her eyes, the kind that only came from hardship. She didn't meet his gaze, but when he handed her a wool blanket, she took it with a nod of gratitude, clutching it tightly around her narrow shoulders. "You lost?" Samuel asked, his voice low, careful. She hesitated, then gave the faintest nod. "Far from a broken bar camp," she murmured. Her accent was heavy, her English broken, but the meaning was clear. She had been separated from her people. Samuel knew the Comanche did not forgive lightly. If they discovered one of their own had been taken in by a white settler, they would come for him without hesitation. His cabin was sturdy but small, no match for the fury of a war band. He studied her carefully, trying to see if there was some trick in her arrival, some hidden danger waiting outside in the storm. But all he saw was the girl trembling, hungry, and cold. He ladled out a small portion of stew from the pot hanging over the fire and set it before her. She ate in silence, each bite quick and cautious, as though afraid it might be taken away. Samuel leaned back in his chair, his mind turning circles. He thought of his wife, gone these 3 years, and his daughter, who had died younger than this girl from a fever that no doctor could cure. Something about the way the girl held the spoon, her thin hands trembling yet determined, stirred that buried memory until it ached. "You'll rest here tonight," Samuel said finally, though part of him already regretted the decision. She looked up at him then, truly meeting his eyes for the first time. For just a moment, he saw relief in her face, a softening that spoke louder than words. She pulled the blanket tighter, curling near the fire, and within minutes her breathing grew slow and steady with sleep. Samuel sat long into the night, listening to the storm lash against the cabin walls, his rifle close by, his thoughts restless. He knew he had crossed an invisible line. By taking her in, he had bound himself to consequences he could not yet see. He didn't know that come morning, the horizon would thunder with hooves, and the kindness he had shown would place him at the center of a storm far more dangerous than the one outside his door. The first light of dawn crept slowly over the prairie, a pale gold that chased the shadows from the land. Samuel Turner had barely slept, his mind too restless, ears tuned to every sound of the storm and to the steady breathing of the Comanche girl curled near his hearth. The cabin smelled faintly of damp wool, wood smoke, and stew gone cold. But it was quiet now, too quiet. Samuel stepped outside with his rifle cradled in his arm, squinting against the soft glare of morning. The world was hushed in that peculiar way that often came before something terrible. At first, he thought it was only the wind carrying a distant vibration, but soon he realized it was deeper, heavier, rhythmic. The ground beneath his boots trembled ever so slightly. Samuel's breath caught. It wasn't thunder, it was hooves. He lifted his eyes to the horizon, and his blood went cold. From the rise to the east, dark shapes appeared, one after another, until they lined the ridge in a living wall. Horsemen, dozens of them. Their silhouettes grew sharper as they descended into view, forming a circle that spread around his small patch of land like a tightening noose. 70 riders, maybe more, their painted faces gleaming with sweat and morning light, their war paint streaked in black and red. The sound of their ponies' hooves grew into a relentless drumbeat, the kind that made the earth itself seem alive. Samuel's mouth went dry as he watched them maneuver with practiced precision. No shouts, no chaos, just a quiet, controlled menace that was far worse. He had heard tales of what a Comanche war party could do, but hearing and seeing were different things. Seeing meant knowing how small and helpless a man truly was against the sheer tide of warriors. At their head rode a man unlike the others. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his chest bare but for a necklace of claws and beads that rattled as his horse moved. His face was marked with lines of scar and paint, his black hair adorned with eagle feathers that caught the light. He sat on his horse like a king of the plains, unmoving, yet carrying an authority that rippled outward. Samuel knew without asking that this was the chief, the father of the girl he had sheltered. The cabin door creaked open behind him, and the girl's soft gasp reached his ears. She rushed to the window, eyes wide, staring at the riders who now encircled every corner of the homestead. She pressed her hand to the glass as if she could reach across the distance. Her lips moved, and Samuel heard the word she whispered, filled with both fear and recognition. Father. Samuel's gut twisted. He had feared it the moment he saw her clothing, her features. He had taken in not just a lost child, but the daughter of a leader chief with the power to summon an army. And that army was here, surrounding his house with silent, deadly precision. The chief raised his hand, and at once, the riders halted. The only sound was the snorting of horses and the occasional clink of weapons. The stillness was suffocating. Samuel could feel every pair of eyes on him, sharp and unyielding. He stood in his yard with his rifle in hand, but it felt like a stick against a storm. He could fire once, maybe twice, before he was cut down. His cabin, his corral, his life, yeah, it was all balanced on a knife's edge. The girl turned toward him then, her face paled, her body trembling as though torn between two worlds. Her father was here, fierce and commanding, but she had shared his fire, his food. For one night, Samuel had been her protector. Now, that fragile bond was about to be tested under the eyes of 70 warriors. The chief spurred his horse forward, breaking from the circle. Slowly, deliberately, he rode toward the cabin, his warriors watching in absolute silence. Samuel's heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst through his chest. He didn't lower his rifle, but he didn't raise it either. Every instinct screamed that the wrong movement, the wrong word, would ignite this gathering into violence. He thought of his daughter again, gone too soon, and wondered if perhaps this was how he would join her cut down in the yard of the home he had built with his own hands. The horse stopped only a few yards away, the chief's piercing gaze fixed on him. For a long, endless moment, neither man spoke. The silence of the warriors was a weight pressing down on Samuel's shoulders. He swallowed hard, sweat slicking his palms, and waited for the storm he knew was coming. The chief dismounted with a slow, deliberate grace, the kind that told Samuel this was no ordinary man but one who carried his authority like a second skin. The warriors around them didn't move, didn't speak. Their silence was sharper than any blade. Samuel gripped his rifle tightly, not lifting it, not lowering it, just holding on as if it anchored him in that moment. His throat was dry, every beat of his heart loud enough he feared the Comanche could hear it. The chief stepped forward, the ground crunching softly beneath his moccasins, his tall figure casting a long shadow in the rising sun. Behind Samuel, the cabin door flew open and the girl darted out, her bare feet slapping the dirt as she ran. "Father!" she cried, the words spilling out in her native tongue, her voice trembling with relief. She threw herself against the chief, clinging to his arm with both hands. The warrior who had seemed carved from stone finally shifted, his expression breaking for just an instant. His hand came down on her shoulder, steady, protective, and the lines in his face eased as she began to speak rapidly in Comanche. Her words tumbled out in a rush, pointing back at the cabin, back at Samuel, her voice pleading. Samuel stood rooted to the spot, every instinct screaming at him to back away, but he forced himself to stay. This was no time to appear weak. He couldn't understand her words, but he knew she was explaining what had happened, how she had come to his door in the storm, how he had given her shelter instead of turning her away. He prayed her version of the truth would be enough to spare him from the wrath that hung in the air like a drawn bow. The chief's dark eyes turned back to him, sharp and unreadable. Samuel felt pinned beneath that gaze, as though the man were measuring every part of him, his stance, his breath, the honesty in his face. Time seemed to stretch unbearably long. Samuel dared a single step forward, slowly setting his rifle down on the ground between them. He lifted his empty hands, palms open, a gesture of peace. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, but he forced the words out. She was cold. She was lost. I did what any man would do. Fed her, gave her shelter, nothing more. The chief's expression didn't change, but the girl clutched his arm tighter, speaking again, her tone softer now, almost pleading. Samuel could see the struggle in the chief's eyes, anger warred with pride, suspicion with honor. This was a man who had fought battles, who had seen betrayal, who had lost friends and brothers to settlers like Samuel. Trust was not given lightly here. Finally, the chief spoke, his voice deep, his English broken but clear enough to pierce the silence. You gave shelter. You fed my blood. Each word landed like the weight of stone. Samuel didn't move, didn't even breathe, waiting for more. The chief's face softened only slightly, but the danger in his eyes remained. Many would not. Samuel felt a flicker of relief, but it was thin, fragile. He knew this wasn't forgiveness. This was something else. A pause, a moment on the edge of war. The warriors around them shifted slightly, their horses restless, their eyes locked on him with suspicion and hate. One wrong move, one wrong word, and this fragile line of mercy would snap. The girl pressed her forehead to her father's arm, murmuring in their language. The chief finally lifted his hand and rested it briefly on her head, his gaze still locked on Samuel. The message was clear, her safety, her word, had bought Samuel this breath of time. But it was only a beginning. Samuel lowered his arms, every muscle trembling, the weight of the standoff pressing hard on him. He understood then that he was no longer master of his own fate. His choice to shelter the girl had tied him, for better or worse, to the will of this chief and his people. In that moment, he wasn't just a settler defending his home. He was a man standing on trial in the open air of the prairie, with 70 warriors holding the power of judge, jury, and executioner in their silent hands. The chief's gaze lingered, then he gave the faintest nod, one that felt as heavy as a mountain. Samuel exhaled slowly, knowing he was not Safi, not Yeda, but alive, at least for now. The silence after the chief's words stretched long and heavy, a silence broken only by the stamping of horses and the occasional rattle of weapons. Samuel stood motionless, the air thick with tension, his body aching from holding himself so still. The chief gave a sharp command in his native tongue, and at once the circle of warriors shifted, closing tighter around the cabin. Spears angled forward, bows were drawn, and Samuel's heart lurched. Though he had not been cut down where he stood, he realized this was not over. It was a test, and the outcome was still uncertain. The chief's eyes never left him. He gestured, and 2 warriors rode closer, their ponies kicking up dust as they circled him slowly, inspecting, measuring. Samuel's hand itched to grab his rifle from the ground, but he knew the instant he moved, his life would end. He kept his hands open at his sides, every breath deliberate. The girl spoke again, her voice soft, urgent, clinging to her father's arm, her words pleading in the Comanche tongue. Samuel couldn't understand her, but he saw the way the chief's gaze flicked between her and him, the way the lines on his face deepened as he weighed the truth of her story. One of the warriors shouted something sharp, his eyes narrowing with hate. Another laughed darkly, as if amused at the idea of sparing a settler. Samuel's stomach churned. He could feel the anger radiating off them, the hunger for blood that was only barely held back by their leader's will. For a moment, Samuel thought they would cut him down anyway, chief's words or not. He braced himself for it, jaw tightening, body coiled with a grim kind of acceptance. Then, without warning, the chief stepped closer and thrust out his hand. The motion was sudden, startling, and Samuel stiffened, uncertain. But it wasn't an attack. The hand was open, palm outward, held between them in the unmistakable gesture of recognition, and not friendship, not yet, but acknowledgement. Samuel stared at it, stunned, his breath caught in his chest. Slowly, cautiously, he extended his own hand, rough and calloused from years of labor, and pressed it to the chief's. The grip was firm, unyielding, filled with strength. It was not a promise of peace but a command: live by this trust, or die by its betrayal. The warriors lowered their weapons at the chief's signal. Though their expressions did not soften, their eyes burned holes into Samuel, full of suspicion, resentment, and warning. The circle loosened, hooves pounding as the riders began to pull back from his cabin, still wary, still watchful. Dust rose in thick clouds as the ring broke apart, the sound of their departure as heavy as their arrival. The chief lingered a moment longer, his hand resting on his daughter's shoulder. He looked once more at Samuel, his gaze steady and sharp as a blade. His voice was low, but every word carried the weight of iron. Today, you live, because you gave shelter, because you fed my blood. But hear me, broken bar. His eyes narrowed, and Samuel felt the threat like cold steel pressed to his throat. If you betray this trust, no wall, no gun, no army will save you. With that, he mounted his horse in one smooth motion, his daughter clinging close beside him. A sharp cry rang out from his lips, and the 70 warriors turned as one, spurring their mounts into a thunderous gallop across the prairie. The ground shook as they vanished into the horizon, their dust cloud lingering in the air long after they were gone. Samuel stood alone in the yard, the silence returning with eerie suddenness. The only sound was his own ragged breathing, the pounding of his heart. He bent, picked up his rifle, and held it loosely, though the fight had drained out of him. His cabin looked the same as it had the night before, yet it felt different, touched now by forces far beyond his control. He glanced at the fire flickering faintly inside, at the blanket still lying crumpled where the girl had slept, and knew his life would never be the same. He had shown compassion, and it had spared him, but it had also tied him to a people the frontier feared and misunderstood. He had not turned their friendship, only their temporary mercy. As the dust settled and the prairie returned to its endless stillness, Samuel understood that one act of kindness had not only saved him but bound him to a promise stronger than any he had made before. And from that day forward, he would live knowing that 70 sets of eyes might be watching, waiting, judging whether he would prove worthy of the mercy he had been granted.